Suffering is the most powerful engine of insight, the most powerful fuel for the generation of new insight that I have ever come across. If you are not suffering, you are not asking yourselves the deeper questions. You don't have your eyes on the ball. When we are not suffering, we live an Epicurean life. We become surfers. We just enjoy the moment. We will look for pleasure and never ask the deeper questions. Life passes us by. But when you suffer, life stops you on your tracks and it forces you to think, to feel, to contemplate, to mature, to develop insights. So to a larger extent than I am personally comfortable with, I recognize that suffering is a tool of nature. Whatever nature is trying to do through us, it uses that tool, because if it wouldn't, we would have Epicurean lives, very superficial, completely unexamined lives. And one day we would find ourselves in our deathbed and look back and think, oh my God, what have I done? Nothing. It's all just passed by. You don't mature, you don't evolve, you don't collect insights unless nature makes you suffer. And sometimes the way nature makes you suffer is self-suffering. Nature operates through you yourself, or something transpersonal in you puts you through that. And when it does that, what it's trying to do is make you look in another direction, make you move your eyes back to the ball, because your eyes are not on the ball. If you start suffering a lot for no reason, self-inflicted suffering, that's the transpersonal within you trying to wake you up to what's supposed to happen through you. So that's how I reconcile it. I don't think my life is about me, and therefore my life is not about my happiness. It's not even about me, let alone my happiness. And I don't see suffering as something we should always fight against. And that's the mistake you make. When you are suffering, the point is to make you look elsewhere. The point is to bring your eyes back to the ball. But instead, we only look at the suffering. That's all we do. We become obsessed with stopping the suffering. Our whole lives become one giant exercise at finding ways to stop the suffering. When you do that, your life will be about suffering because you made it so. And we forget that in conjunction with suffering, parallel to the suffering, there is a lot of life. And that's what the suffering is trying to make you see. Before, you were looking at something in the rest of life that was not what nature was trying to accomplish through you. So when you start suffering, the point is take your eyes off that and put your eyes somewhere else, but not on the suffering itself. The suffering is a tool. It's trying to make you look elsewhere. But instead, we look to the suffering. We look inwards because we think our lives are about us. And suffering is a problem we have to solve. And therefore, meditation, diet, spiritual practice, reading Bernardo Kastrup, listening to Bernardo Kastrup's podcasts. I'm keenly aware that a lot of my audience comes to me because they're trying to stop suffering. My hope is that at some point it changes. At some point, something changes in their minds and they go like, oh, it was not about that at all. It's something else that's going on. So that's how I reconcile it, Artem.
You don't think that happiness, because I've heard people say this before, that happiness is a skill that can be learned. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah. It's false happiness. It's a kind of self-created delusion. If you think happiness is a skill and you can learn to be happy, then you're just deluding yourself. It's not authentic happiness. There are too many variables that are significant when it comes to whether we are happy or not. Too many of them completely outside our own control. It is it's the task of Atlas, who had the weight of the world on his shoulders, to take it upon yourself to make yourself happy. You are going to fail. You may think you have brief successes, but it's not going to abide because there are too many variables. You're part of the world. You're not separate from everything else that's happening. I think what is possible is to live in contentment, which is different from happiness. Contentment is a place where you don't need anything other than you already have, even if you're suffering. It's a kind of acceptance of what is, and it feels good. Contentment feels good. I have reached that. Most of the times I am content, but this contentment has nothing to do with what I thought of as happiness before. It's a completely different quality. Contentment is when you see that your life is unfolding the way nature meant it to. It's not necessarily unfolding the way you would like for your ego to be happy, but it's the way it's supposed to, regardless of the price for yourself. Once you see that, there is a profound relaxation. You sort of relax into life. You relax into what is, because you know you are doing what you're supposed to. You are accepting to be a sort of a vehicle for what nature wants to achieve through you. You know that that's the best you can possibly do, and you're already open to it. You're not resisting it. You're not fighting against it. Then you are content, even in the midst of tragedy and suffering, which I'm not minimizing. Suffering is horrible. If I'm suffering, I have the tendency to oppose it with all my forces. But even then, there is a nuanced, subtle part of you in the back of your mind who says, "It's okay. It's the way it's supposed to unfold. Don't resist it." And to not resist suffering, you need to allow yourself to suffer, which amazingly is the way to contentment. Because if you resist suffering, you multiply the suffering by tenfold. Then you really suffer like a dog. But if you don't resist it, yes, you suffer, but you suffer in contentment. It's a different quality. And it took me 50 years to get there.
Yeah. So the way I think about happiness is I equate happiness with contentment. So there might be like, people use different words. And I think Rupert Spira, he says happiness is our true nature. And I don't know if he's also thinking about happiness as contentment.
Yeah, he
Peace.
does.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I see it in that way. But there's a couple of more pieces there. And I also wonder if these are just semantic things. But it seems to me that suffering is in fact produced by resistance. And this is also the view that meditation adept Shinzen Young has. And I know you were in a conversation with him. I seen a podcast, and he has this formula that pain times resistance equals suffering. So if there is zero resistance, there is zero suffering from that view. You speak about going through this shift in the last few years where you've come to a place of non-resistance, yet you claim there's still suffering. How could there be suffering if there's no resistance? I'm curious. I'm really curious how you think about this.
Well, I don't think the equation is correct.
Oh, okay.
That's how we reconcile it. I think there is natural suffering. If you lose a loved one, even if you don't resist it, you accept the person is gone. He's not going to come back. You still suffer. To deny that is, even if you don't resist it, you still suffer because it's natural. It's part of nature. It's how the human psyche is put together. I think it is presumptuous to think you can bypass that or you can avoid that which is natural. What you can do is avoid brooding. Brooding compounds suffering. It brings attention to suffering, amplifies it, makes it multi-layered. Now, that you can avoid. But if you don't resist, you have just pain and no suffering. I don't think life works like that. And I don't think it should work like that, because if it were true, you would not get out of bed in the morning and you would have no impetus. You would never be forced to confront the big questions. you would not even seek the spiritual path because you're not suffering, you know, no resistance, no suffering. Why are you going to the enlightened master? What are you trying to achieve? Know what I mean? So no, I think yes, brooding compounds suffering, resistance compounds suffering, but with zero resistance, there is natural suffering. Many things in nature make us suffer. If you're a farmer and you you and your family have gone through tremendous work through the end of the winter and spring to plant your seeds, make everything all right, and then finally, your crop is growing and it's fragile, and and then there comes a hailstorm and destroys everything. If you don't suffer, you're a psychopath. There's something wrong with you. Of course you will suffer. Nature has just slapped you in the face big time, which nature's prone to do. The monstrosity of the world inevitably leads to suffering. Very natural suffering, independent of your resistance. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if you know that there is nothing wrong with that, then contentment comes in the company of suffering. That's what I'm trying to express. There is contentment in the face of suffering. As a farmer, you can go, I did everything I could. I did what nature expected of me. This hailstorm is not under my control. And yes, I suffer because, my life will become a lot harder now. But it is how it is. Maybe it happened because I need to confront certain questions that I was not paying attention to before. And we go on. That's life. It has suffering. It's natural. It's unnatural to be happy all the time. Who came up with this rotten idea? You have to be so disconnected from nature to think that you can be happy all the time and never suffer. To think that there is some kind of alchemical formula, some kind of recipe, the 7 steps to eliminating suffering. It's absolutely unnatural. What you can do is eliminate brooding and suffering, unnecessary suffering amplification. But suffering is normal. It's part of life. It's part of nature. It has its uses. It's a good tool. We would like it not to be there because we are deluded, egoic idiots. But nature wants it to be there. It's extraordinarily useful. I would not have written a single book if I didn't suffer. I would be building nice computers to this day and nothing else, having fun. And diving, which I love to do. I would be just diving, hiking in the mountains, and building fun computers, designing fun computers. Now, that's not what nature wanted to do through me. So how does it make me comply with its plan? It makes me suffer, gives me anxiety, gives me frustration. And these things force me to correct my course. They are part of my inner compass. If there are too many days I wake up and I'm not feeling good about what I'm about to do, then okay, that's suffering, right? So suffering is the compass telling you you're going the wrong direction because your natural path is more or less effortless. When you are on the path that nature wants to express through you, doors tend to open, things tend to be easy. When things are getting very difficult and you're suffering a lot, that's nature telling you, no, that's not the path of least resistance. That's not what you're trying to do here. But we fight against it. And the image I have is, I have this apple tree every spring around this time of the year, a couple of weeks earlier. It's covered in white blossoms. And I have this image that one of those blossoms concludes that its life is about it. A very neurotic blossom and completely deranged. Of course, its life is not about it. Its purpose is to attract a bee, to pollinate a seed, so the blossom dies in order to create a fruit. So the fruit can fall to the ground and a new apple tree arise. So life can go on. That's what it's meant to do. But it thinks that its life is about it. So the blossom never wants to die in late spring. It wants to stay alive. Well, if they would get it their way, apple trees would disappear in one generation. So if Bernardo got it his way, to build fun computers, dive and hike in the mountains, something would stop. Something that nature wants to do wouldn't happen. So look, I think we live such unnatural lives in the West, and the West now is across the world. We contaminated everybody. We live such unnatural lives in the West that suffering has also become unnaturally high. And therefore, we have now mobilized all of our energies to stop suffering. But in the process of doing that, we forget to live. Because life is not about your attempt to stop suffering. If that's what you choose to do, you will not live. All the rest of life will pass you by. You will not even notice. You will not notice all the wonderful things that are happening while you are suffering, happening to you while you are suffering. You will not notice the value of your suffering in triggering your mind towards greater depth and insight. Because you are trying to stop the suffering instead of looking where the suffering wants you to look, instead of seeing what the suffering is trying to show you. You're so self-absorbed in the need to stop the suffering because of our unnatural lives that now everything has become about us. All apple tree blossoms now think that their lives are about them, and none of them wants to die. So no more apples, no more seeds, no more apple trees. That's our dilemma. It's profoundly neurotic and unnatural. And we turned Eastern philosophy into sedative. We're not trying to be enlightened. Maybe some are, but the vast majority of people I see are not trying to be enlightened. What they are trying to do is to stop suffering. And therefore, spirituality becomes spiritual bypass, which is equally unnatural. It's not the point. It's not the point of Eastern spirituality. It's our misunderstanding of Eastern spirituality. These guys have been on it for 1,000 years longer than we do. They know a thing or more better than we do. But we do have our own path, which is not theirs. We have our own path. And I think the Western path is to engage with life, not to try to run away from it in a form of spiritual bypassing, in the hope that suffering will stop. Well, kill yourself then. Well, not even that will stop your suffering.
Yeah,
Under analytic idealism.
Not from the idealist view.
The way to go, I think, for the Western mind is to engage with the world in a manner that is natural, in a manner that creates space for contentment and suffering, in a manner that honors nature, including the part of nature that causes suffering. Engage with life, not run away from it, not go up to a mountain and meditate for 30 years, but engage with life. That's what nature's trying to do through us. That's what nature has always tried to do through us. We have this peculiar disposition that we engage with the world. We don't try to escape the world. In the East, you engage with the world in the first half of life. In the second half of life, you disengage. That's not idiotic. It's not unnatural. It's natural for them. And I don't want to get into the details of why this is the case. They are in a different place in the mind space of nature. It makes sense to them, but it doesn't fit our character. Our character is not to disengage. We want to disengage because we don't want to suffer. You see, but what we would really like is to remain engaged, but minimize suffering. That's what we are trying to achieve. And amazingly enough, the way to do that is to stop fighting the suffering, is to honor the value suffering has, to honor it as part of nature. Okay, you too exist. You too have the right to be here, Mr. Suffering. It is part of life that I suffer if I lose a loved one. It is part of life. It's part of life that I suffer if I fail at what I'm trying to do. Now, let's honor that. Let's bring that in. Make it part of ourselves. One of the colors of the palette that creates the painting of our lives. Suffering is one of the colors. It creates contrasts. If you don't have black, nothing looks bright in a painting if you don't have the dark colors. And that's the exercise for the Western mind, I